I think we'll get started now. So I'm Laurel Sutton. I'm the host of the Linguistics CareerCast podcast, and I am joined today by three incredible panelists, and we are going to be talking about generative AI and how that interfaces with linguistics. For those of you who were at LingComm and heard Emily Bender's talk, there's going to be a bit of overlap with what we talk about today and her area, because obviously she is now, whether she wants to be or not, kind of the face of linguistics when it comes to Gen AI. And she has done an awful lot of really important work. And today, we want to talk about how this is working in both industry and academia, and hence our three panelists. So I'd like to ask everybody just to introduce themselves briefly and talk a little bit about what they're doing. So Alicia, why don't you go first?
Sure. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Alicia Beckford Wassink, and I am the director of the Sociolinguistics Laboratory and a professor of linguistics at the University of Washington. I guess I should also mention I am currently the vice president-elect of the Linguistic Society of America, and an external examiner in phonetics at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And in the past, I did work for Microsoft Research as a consultant as well for a few years. So that's where I come into this. I say that I am a sociolinguist that entered ASR through the side door because I first encountered it actually using ASR to help me with analysis of data for underrepresented dialects of English. And I discovered in that process that it didn't work equally for all of the different dialects that I was needing to analyze. And it ended up being more work for some of them than for others. That is very much at the center of the work that I do right now. I'm running a project that is actually going around the United States, asking people from underrepresented varieties about their experiences with AI, particularly focusing on voice tech. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and what brings me here.
Oh, that's great. Everybody, it's going to be so many three-letter acronyms today, just to let you know. We'll try to elucidate that in the comments. Emily Pace has put in ASR, automatic speech recognition. That's a big one, and LLMs, which stands for large language models. I'm sure there'll be more. And if anybody has a question about something, put it in the chat and we can clarify. So Katie, can you go next and talk about yourself?
I absolutely can. Hi, my name is Katie Swindler. I'm also absolutely enthused to be here. I graduated from the Georgetown Masters in Language and Communication program in 2023 under Alex Johnston. So super excited to be back with this crowd. My research in my master's program focused on agency and identity in mental health discourse, which is a topic I'm extremely interested in. Using narrative and other sociolinguistic discourse analytic applications. Now I am a program manager for Mother Tongue AI, which is a company that does content management for generative AI model training. So essentially we provide data curation, content generation, writing, rating, annotation for model fine-tuning programs, generally for large tech companies.
Awesome, that's great. And Aubrie.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Aubrie Amstutz. I got my master's in linguistics and cognitive studies from the University of Siena in Italy. And after that, I started working in language tech. So I did actually work in tech before I went back and got my master's. So I've been working in tech in different ways for like over a decade, I think. Managing help desk, working on like organizational change management, which is also really interesting now that we're looking at AI and where AI fits into like organizations. And also like, working on large scale product rollouts at different like enterprise level, which is like large company or university level. And so I learned a lot there about sort of product market fit, which I think is really interesting with AI since there's a little bit of hype going on. We can talk about that. And also I worked, so after I came back from my master's in Italy, that's where I started working more in language tech, as I said. And so I've worked at Microsoft Research. I've worked at Duolingo, Scale AI, which I think is maybe similar to Mother Tongue, and Apple. I was also product policy analyst at TikTok. And currently I'm the interim lead of responsible AI research team at one of the companies that I just mentioned above. I am like a vendor, and so I'm not technically allowed to disclose it. And we work on evaluating features or models in different scenarios. So coming up with what are the risks that need to be evaluated, more on like the trust and safety side. What are the risks that need to be evaluated, and how would we go about evaluating those? Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And I hope everybody is observing that our three panelists, there's a wide range of expertise here in different areas, and that's why they're on the panel. So we can look at this from different perspectives and with different levels of expertise. I thought it would be useful at this point for our audience to just give some basic definitions of what we're talking about, because so many acronyms and words get thrown around when nobody ever defines them. So generally, AI stands for artificial intelligence, and it's a huge term that just gets applied to so many things, many of which are not actually artificial intelligence. In my opinion, as we were saying at the beginning, we have strong opinions about all this. AI is bad, and Emily Bender was talking about this a little bit too in her talk, because it anthropomorphizes what's going on. It's not intelligent, right? And in the same way we think about human intelligence, it's very fast. It can do a lot of things very, very quickly. It can make connections, but it's not intelligent the way that human beings think about intelligent. And this is further obfuscated, I would say, by things like chatbots, right? We call them chatbots, and chat is a word that we apply to human beings, but they're not human beings. They can mimic it, but they're not. So AI generally refers to this processing of large language models, lots and lots of information that's being fed into it. And for language models, what's being fed in is all kinds of stuff, right? It's factual, it's satire. You know, there was stuff about the Onion articles being fed into it. It's fanfic, it's blogs, it's people's papers. I checked, my stuff was in LibGen, which was the latest thing that was put out there saying, yeah, all this stuff was scraped. Nobody knew it. Nobody gave their permissions, but it all went into these large language models. So that's what they do. They take this data and then they do essentially pattern matching to come up with generative AI, which literally means like it's generating language from it. There's another part of AI, analytical AI, which you sometimes see when people are talking about, you know, computer programs recognizing tumors because they can see all these different very small things. And that's amazing. Like that kind of work is really beneficial to all kinds of scientific research. But we're talking about the generative kind, so actually generating language. I feel like, again, people really think that whatever is generating it is thinking and coming up with human responses, and that just isn't the case. So I'd like to know like, how do you guys think about generative AI? Like, what is the definition in your head of what's actually happening? Katie, why don't you go first?
So, yeah, I think that point is the most important thing to get across right away. These models aren't understanding and interacting with the content that they are being trained on and the content that they're producing, right? And we talk about it colloquially, like even within industry, within research, we talk about it as like, oh, the model understood this, the model did this, didn't do that. The models don't understand. They are essentially prediction machines that are predicting an output based on patterns in the data that's being input for their training. And of course, you can generate novel content for images, for sound, for speech. But as linguists, I think we're mostly concerned with text and with speech generation. So understanding, first of all, that it's not interpreting and internalizing the content that you give it is really like the first critical piece to distinguishing why there is something harmful about this kind of language generation.
Aubrie, what about you?
Yeah, I think I really like the kind of dichotomy that the new book AI Snake Oil, which I highly recommend, uses, which is like predictive versus generative, I feel like that helps me kind of think about what it actually produces, right? Like it produces a prediction or it produces something. So I think when you're thinking about the fact that AI is like all predictions really and all probability, it's sort of like, okay, what is the applied version of that? And that's generative AI. It's like the applied version of the probability. What is the most likely next token? Um, I like to think of it like improv a little bit. I don't know if anyone has ever done improv or been to improv, but if you've been on both sides of it, especially, it's sort of like you're really just letting your mind flow. You're trying to get in that flow state where you're sort of accessing this like corpus of data, right? And language and thinking, what's the next most likely word? What would be funny? What would be, appropriate? What would be whatever? But it's just kind of coming to you. You're not really like, you don't have a whole plan. You're not trying to get somewhere. Maybe vaguely you have an idea where you want to get, but you don't have like, when I was in my bachelor's, I was doing creative writing. And so I was writing like screenplays, and you need to have a very detailed outline. That does not exist. It is just sort of winging it. And so I think that helps sort of remove some of that agency and the intention, like we're talking about, if you think of it that way.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm glad you mentioned agency. I think that's going to come up more as we talk. And Alicia, from what you were saying before, a lot of your work focuses on the input as well. Like it's whatever the models are, if they're not taking in proper input, like we used to say, garbage in, garbage out, right? It's not going to actually produce something that's accurate. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the things I really love the ways that you've characterized generative AI, Katie and Aubrie. I think that it makes me think about this idea that language is polyglot in some of the ways that we think about as sociolinguists think about how people come up with the things that they say. Our languages are full of the words and characteristics and features of others that we've heard from our environment. And so, in this way, I guess this is partly how I think about AI as well. It is not coming up with something new. It's not agentive. It's not creating language. It pulls from what is environmentally available to it in creating quote unquote new things. And so it's not new. It carries the characteristics of things that are out there already. And to the extent that things are limited, to the extent that there is a bias in what it has available to it out in the world, that bias is going to be reproduced in what it comes up with. And there is no ability to sort of say, hey, this is potentially misrepresenting or underrepresenting, so let me try to deal with that. No, it's just going to put that out there as as material to be replicated and incorporated. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, that's great. And the bias part is just huge. I have seen so many articles talking about, the great thing about generative AI is that it's not biased. And I can't even believe people think that. Crazy. Okay, so I'm sure we'll come back to that as we discuss all this. I also wanted to give our audience kind of a feel for what linguists are doing in AI. AI is a field where a lot of linguists are now being employed, right? This didn't even exist 10 years ago, but now it's a place you can get a job. So if you're studying linguistics and you're not interested in staying in academia, maybe you want to go into industry and there are jobs available. So I have seen through the career cast, and if people are interested, I've done interviews with people who have lots of different jobs in the field, and you can sort of listen to everybody do a deep dive. For example, the one we just posted this week was with Jyoti Iyer, and she works on chatbots. So her job is looking at some of the data that comes in and making sure that the chatbots are responding to people appropriately and picking up on keywords and using the language that's correct. So that's like one little bitty part of it. So I was hoping you all could talk a little bit about where you see linguists fitting in as employed in the field of Gen AI. Aubrie.
Sure. Um, so I'll talk a little bit about one of my first experiences with AI, which was working at Duolingo on the English test when that was new, because COVID was happening, and so folks weren't able to go in person to take their English exams, and they needed the English certification in order to go to school the next year. And so it really ballooned. And so we're basically, because I had a teaching English to speakers of other languages certification, I was able to be like an AI sort of trainer, quality, control analyst type person, which was where I first started to think about bias. And so that was something that I was like a very specific skill that I had, which was teaching English. And I was able to bring that to the technology, and sort of help them train a model that would be, trying to replicate that same knowledge or skill that I had in my brain about certifying people, and it did pretty well. But that was one of the first places that I noticed that, the ASR wasn't working great, but I didn't even quite have the skills to figure out what was going on. But I was like, some of these, some people's accents don't seem to be getting as high as they should be. I can understand, lexically they're doing fine, but maybe the phonology is just a little bit difficult for the system to recognize for whatever reason. So that's one example. I think there's so many different AI training. So like if you have one area of linguistics that you're really interested in, and there is a technology that is trying to replicate or, support, let's say, that field, I think you can dive in there. And then obviously, as Katie, I'm sure we'll talk about, there's a lot of like, you don't need to have a specialty, right? Like there's lots of data that needs to be created, and your job can be going about figuring out what that looks like and what are the dimensions that need to be absolutely represented, and which can we say maybe that's not as important in this context. So I think that's a different like sort of applied version of that.
Yeah. Alicia, I wanted to especially get your perspective because you're still in academia, but what you're doing straddles the line a bit. It always strikes me when talking with people about the work that they do, especially in tech, that it's just what you do as a linguist, right? Like it's sort of basic gathering data and looking at it and then finding out like what's coming out of it. So sometimes people will say like, oh, if I wanted to get a job in tech, I need to know coding and I need to know all this really esoteric stuff. And you don't really. Your training as a linguist has prepared you for this because you have a hypothesis, you gather a bunch of data or you solicit data, you put it together, you look at it, and you figure out like what's going to be the outcome that I want out of this. That's what we do. That's what we're trained to do. Field methods, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So Alicia, yeah, talk about that a bit.
Yeah, field methods for sure. I think one of the interesting things to me is that one of the first skills that we talked about when I was working for the tech firm was just how I learned how to gather data in speech communities. Like, how do you actually
Mhm.
get linguistic forms from people in communities? What communities do you go to? What kinds of ways do we have to enable us to vet the kinds of features that we get and make sure they're what we actually want? I think that those are general skills that you learn when you are learning how to collect data as a linguist. And they turned out to be variable or valuable in ways that I was kind of surprised by. And I mean, that wasn't at the heart of the work that I did. So I'm not disclosing too much, but there was a real interest in that. And so at that end, I think the field work is important. But I'm going to also say that for me as a sociolinguist, knowing where the variation lies in human language is really important as well. So some of the work that we're doing is actually to try to figure out how to leverage the knowledge that sociolinguists have of phonetic and phonological variation, to try to understand both where models have difficulty, like what dialect features of English are a real challenge for automatic speech recognition models, and how can we characterize those? Like when we're thinking about the acoustic models, what does that mean? When we're thinking about the ways that the acoustic models interact with the language model, right? How do those interactions potentially scale up certain kinds of errors? So I feel like I have to say I'm having a lot of fun bringing this aspect of my academic training into it. And I think my students are as well. So can I give you one of my favorite examples? So
Oh, please.
one of the things that I did today was to bring some of the examples of errors that we have found in the models. And so one of my favorite ones is the situation where an African American respondent of ours said the word married as merit, and the ASR system came back with Mahel Barrett. That was the transcription. And so if you really think about that, if you break that down phonetically, I mean, number one, it's kind of crazy because it's married is a very common word. Mahel Barrett, does anybody know what Mahel Barrett was? Mahel Barrett was the voice of the Starship Enterprise. She is the actor who played the voice of the ship for many decades. So,
Yeah.
right, infrequent word. But when you actually look at the acoustics of both of those, Mary and Mahel Barrett, you begin to see where some of the problems are in the acoustic model and some of the dialect features that are potentially being left out that then propagate to create other problems. So I would say that sociophonetic training is really super important for the work that we're doing.
That's great. It's a great example. She was also Nurse Chapel in the original Star Trek.
Yes, she was.
Yeah. As you were talking, Alicia, I was also thinking part of what I've seen, and this is in my work too a bit, is uh, other areas of sociolinguistics become very important, like politeness study and Gracian maxims and pragmatics, because no language is in a void, right? Like there's stuff surrounding it, and sometimes it's important and sometimes it's not. But just to know that that exists and you can't divorce any language from the context in which it occurs. And I think that's something that non-linguists don't think about very much. They sort of assume like, oh, language, it just exists and it's all by itself. And it's like, well, it never is because it's spoken by humans and humans have all this stuff that's layered over the top of it. And just knowing that that exists helps you collect the data better because you know how to interact with the people you're collecting data from and also analyze it to see where the variations might be coming in, whether it's a result of who they're talking to or what their responses might be. Um, and I have spoken with people in tech who find this fascinating because they don't know anything about it. And they're sort of amazed, like, oh, that's a thing? Like, that's what linguists do? Like, yeah, that's really what linguists do. So, um, sociolinguistics and Gen AI and tech, it all goes together. It's not like they're separated like this. It's all together. You can't have one without the other. Katie.
So many great points that I already want to just like jump onto and go in 10 different directions. But dialing back to like linguists, how are linguists impacting this field? Where are the opportunities? I think the route that I took into this is pretty similar to Aubrey's. I started out also as just like a contract QA editor, content editor, kind of QA, quality assurance, and analysis of model output to determine whether it was adhering to guidelines or not. One thing that's really interesting is the company that I work for, Mother Tongue, was originally a localization and transcreation company. And what happened is we had a client who had used us for years as a vendor for transcreation services. And when they got the opportunity to start working on a Gen AI model, they said, oh, these people know language, let's bring them over. And so now we have an entire business unit that's just dedicated to content management, content generation, analysis of model responses. Like Aubrie was saying, those making decisions, right, about like what is useful in what context, what do we need to focus on, what do we need to worry about, what's safe and what's unsafe in terms of what we're presenting to the user, and how does the intended user experience influence the decisions that we make on the training side to kind of maximize what the user is getting and make it as organic an experience as possible. In terms of, explaining linguistics and sociolinguistics to tech, I feel like I'm giving a sociolinguistics 101 course really frequently, like at least, a couple times a month, especially when I work with engineers who are like really deep in the programming side. or other, program managers, project managers who have handled mostly technical projects. Generative AI gives us this incredible opportunity to work with actual language data. You're not working with code. Yeah, so I feel like I'm giving a Sociolinguistics 101 course. A really fun example of this is I had a client one time come to me. We're developing guidelines for a new project, and they said, we need you to define natural language. I was like, well, you just stepped in a sociolinguistic landmine and you don't even know it. So that experience, and I want to, go back to this later on in the discussion, is like that experience of like, okay, well, what do you mean when you say natural? And like, what do we mean for the user when you say the user wants a natural language experience? First of all, how do you know that? Have you done the research on what they consider natural, what they want? Second of all, natural in the context of text generation from an AI model and what people are expecting from that, right? Because people bring all these preconceived notions into this interaction. I think, years and years of human-computer interaction studies have shown us that people expect a certain thing when they're interacting with these models. So how do we integrate all of that to make decisions about something as small as punctuation, as word choice, as reading level, as what the content guardrails are? What are we allowed to say and not allowed to say? So that's a place where linguists can really deploy their skills in a way that's, I think, unexpected for people who've had whole careers in tech, and that can be infinitely valuable. And I'm of the opinion that no team working on this stuff should be without a linguist. I mean, it is language. The entire thing is language. Everyone needs a linguist or 5. My company actually has 2 other Georgetown linguists on my team, which has been a lot of fun. But yeah, I absolutely think there's a valuable space for linguists.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's our tagline. You need a linguist for that. Definitely.
Me too.
Yeah, linguists. Yeah, please, Aubrie, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say I would also like to throw one more area in, which is product policy. I forgot to mention this in mine earlier, but I was so surprised when I started working in product policy what like a perfect fit it was. If you're working on policy for a text-based feature, so I was working on policy at TikTok for comments and direct messages. So it was all about what should be allowed by the content moderation, people who are doing that, or the systems. There were also AI systems in place. And how do we describe it? It was like, how do we describe this language? How do we describe what is hate speech versus toxic language? And it was like, yes, I would love to sit down and write what this is in very like discrete terms and come up with examples of what is and isn't correct, and then help the moderators with calibration, talking about more examples. Like, to me, that was like so perfect. And I felt like I didn't see any other linguists working in policy when I was there. So that's another plug. But you do need to have a very robust self-care routine if you're going to be working in trust and safety.
Yeah, I have heard that. I think one thing that I hear as you're all talking, and this is, again, linguistics, is what linguistics allows us to do is to surface and describe the things that we sort of know intuitively. Like you were just talking about, Aubrie, like what is hate speech? Like we all kind of know what it is, maybe, but you can't just go on, we kind of know what it is. You actually have to describe it and write it down. And that goes for all areas of data collection, because you need to know what you're collecting, and then data analysis. Like, what are we looking at? How do we classify things? That's the thing, again, that we learn in linguistics, is sorting stuff into piles and making taxonomies and classifying stuff. I will throw in very quickly an anecdote from my own work. So I ran a naming firm for a number of years, and that was real fun. One of the things that we did when we would test names with people in focus groups, back when we used to have focus groups, when people would gather in a room, you needed to ask people what their reaction was to a name. And even people who were experienced focus group leaders didn't really know how to ask about language. Like, they could hold up a box and say to people, what do you think about this? But when it came to a name, they would invariably just put like a name on the board and go, you like this, don't you? or this sounds a little weird, doesn't it? And it took me coming in to say, you can't ask questions like that. Like, that's not how you do linguistic research. You have to ask it in a way that you're not prompting the answer. And like Katie was just saying, is like, now, okay, I'm going to give you my sociolinguistic lecture on why this is not a good thing to do. But I have found over the years that most people are really receptive to it. So I think there's a little bit of a maybe a misconception. I'm not sure that tech people can be really resistant to that. I personally haven't found that. Usually, once you start explaining about linguistics and what you're doing, they're like, "Oh, you're a wizard. This is incredible. Like I didn't know that this was a thing and that people studied it," and they get really, really into it. So as much as people don't really know what linguistics is, once you can explain it to them in a way that they understand, they get very excited and they're like, "Ooh, let's put this in." So I think that's good. Like I'm always trying to find the positive part about it. Once you can educate people, it will work and people will be like, "Yeah, we do need a linguist for this. We really do."
So have you heard of anyone doing AI focus groups yet?
No, are they? Are people doing
No, I'm
that?
just kidding. I just know they're trying to do AI psychological studies, so I feel like focus groups would be,
I'm sure it's
I
coming.
hope not, but I'm just
I'm sure it's coming.
I'm not convinced that a lot of these decisions are backed up by the appropriate user research on the kind of language features that we're trying to make decisions on, which is, of course, part of the problem, right? It's like we're making decisions without any idea of what user we're actually looking at and what users actually want out of the experience.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? So
Yeah.
Katie's point is absolutely on point. I think that there's room for discourse analysis in this too. And so we have in the work that I do, which is actually finding out about users' experience, we're actually using discourse analysis for that as well. And so that's absolutely critical for trying to understand user responses.
yeah, I
Mhm.
would say that not only because AI is so new, does it have this sort of we're still figuring out, what it should be and shouldn't be, and should it have a persona, and should it change how it talks when it starts talking to you? Is that appropriate or is that weird? So like there's all of that nebulousness, but then also if you're working in tech, you're often working on brand new features that you're not allowed to talk about. And you may not
Yeah.
even be allowed to focus group because it would be too obvious what it
Mhm.
is and it might get out. And
Yeah.
so then you're really working with hypotheticals. And especially when you're thinking about safety, you're going, okay, what are the bad actors? What could they
Mhm.
want to get out of this system? How might they go about doing that? Who might get caught up in that system that we set up for the bad actors because they just happened to, hit the wrong thing button and they
Yeah.
ended up in that, via the algorithm. Yeah, so I think that like that the ability to not only do, inductive and deductive research, but I think it's abductive research is the one where you're sort of like hypothetical, is really, really important skill.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And I think, because these products are so kind of secret and like stuffed in a box, and you have these very small teams that are working on them oftentimes. Even the folks that are doing research and doing appropriate research about the target populations, right? I think one of the big issues that I have with a lot of the applications of this generative AI technology is we assume that all users are going to have the same experience and are going to want the same experience.
Mhm.
And your target audience becomes everybody that uses a computer instead of, you know, um, people who are using this tool for a very specific reason in a very specific way. Obviously, there's a commercial incentive to maximize the audience that you have, especially when you have these huge large language models that a lot of these like the top companies have put out. But when the research is done, it can't be shared. It's all proprietary. So I'm sure we have really good research on some of this stuff, but it's locked within these silos. And so we can't access it. It's considered a competitive advantage to have it.
Mhm.
So it makes it difficult to know what work has already been done.
Yeah. That's a great point. It kind of leads into the next question I wanted to bring up, which is, what do people not realize about the language data that the large language models use? And Katie, you just brought up a really good point, is that I think, again, most people think it's just out there and people use it and it's all freely available and everybody's looking at the same stuff. And that's absolutely not true. A lot of it is, as you said, locked up, or companies don't have access to certain things, or they're pulling from a certain data set, or they don't realize that their data sets have been contaminated either by onion articles or AI generated stuff, which is going to ruin whatever you had. So I'd love it if each of you could just talk a little bit about maybe other things that people don't realize about where the data is coming from. Alicia, I think this is particularly pertinent to your work.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that I think may be a misunderstanding is that the bigger these models get, the better they get at representation. So we focus a lot on representation bias and historic bias in our work, and representation bias is just saying that the data that is accessible to these models for learning draws from a limited number of humans, of human populations. And so the bigger these models get is not necessarily the case that they're getting deeper as well. There are still difficulties getting data from underrepresented dialects. This is something that happens because it is very costly. To get that data, like I said before, it's very costly to go into underrepresented communities. I'm not the first person to observe this. There's literature talking about this difficulty. Like we've been testing to the same benchmarks for the last 20, 25 years. And it's not the case that the benchmarks are changing to increase the diversity that's inside the data sets that are being used for testing and training models. We're getting data sets and continuing to access data sets that continue to have the same biases that they did 20 years ago. There are some notable exceptions to that, but I think that there's like a lot of there may be some misunderstanding out there. There is in conversations that I'm having that that the bigger these models get, the deeper they get. And the other thing I think I want to talk about is that crowdsourcing doesn't necessarily get you better data either. I think when you look at Mozilla's Common Voice, one of the things that you'll see is that I'm thinking about American dialects because that's where I spend a lot of my research time, but there is more data about worldwide Englishes than there is about American English dialects, right? So those groups keep growing. But then we still have a tendency to think about American English as being somewhat monolithic. We still think about African American English as being monolithic. In the research that we've just done in Atlanta, for example, some of our speakers identified as so you have Caribbean accented African American English, you have Southern accented African American English. Some of our speakers were Black and Cambodian, Hebrew Black, Black Latino. And these are not as rare identities as you would think. I mean, Cambodian and Black may be, right? And so multi-ethnic people are being left out. That is huge. And the kinds of impacts that come about through language contact and dialect contact are still underrepresented. So, all of that is to just say that bigger is not necessarily better. And unfortunately, I think that that is an approach that that has led the industry to move away from dialect recognition. So if you talk to people who are working in ASR, a lot of the models are kind of shying away from being able to represent more specificity and more variation in dialects. And just again, because that's very costly, it's computationally expensive, and it's very hard to find appropriate amounts of data to do that testing and training data set split that is so foundational for modeling.
Yeah. Wow, that's such great points, and it gets right back to the bias part again, right? And I feel like it supports the overall racist assumption in the U.S. anyway that standard white English is the standard, and everybody else just has to suck it up, right? Like there's no room for you. It has to be this, and this is all we're going to deal with, and there's no point in doing anything else because why should we care about people who aren't the standard, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I'll say a little bit more about this later, but we're looking at emotion words right now, ways that people talk about how they feel when ASR doesn't work for them. And one of the most interesting ones that we're finding is that a lot of people say it makes them feel invisible or
Mm.
erased, or invalidated.
Wow, those are strong words. Aubrie, do you want to pick this up?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think it's a nice segue because my point was going to be similar, which is just that because the way that we have been the let's say uh, the style of AI that we are working with right now is so big data heavy, and because we are sort of expecting it to be able to um, draw patterns from draw its own patterns from big data versus like having a smaller data set and then maybe training it to do a very specific thing more hard coded. Um, there's this need for big data, and I think this is we're going to get into this in a little bit, but um, when you're internal to a tech company, when they've already scraped the internet for the foundation, where do you go for the like where's the next source, where's the next data source? And so we can work really really hard and create a carefully constructed data set that maybe contains 500 utterances, and then what a training or an AI team is going to do with that is take it and probably write their own, recipe or their own description of what they think we did, and then have, yeah, everybody already knows, have an LLM generate a bunch more tokens that may or may not actually align with like the dimensions that we were trying to represent. And so I understand, like, I don't know what else to do here, but it's problematic to me that you would try to train AI with AI, but that's sort of just where we are, right? Like, how do we ever move the bar up? How do we make sure that we're capturing changes and new slang and new whatever if we're always just in a little bit of a circle, a cycle? So I don't quite know how this is going to get solved, but it's a huge issue for us in tech trying to create high quality and also diverse tokens of language that we need to train and also keep back for testing. Yeah, it's very expensive. I think that because people got used to AI being, trained on the whole internet, quote unquote, out of the box, now they expect it to be a bit less expensive than it might end up being. I think the ROI might be changing a little bit as folks realize, oh, you can get this out of the box, but when you really get it to work well in your context, you got to do a lot of training. You have to create a lot of data. You have to hire probably writers, people with different backgrounds. And you're still probably asking them to try to write in standard American English. So you're not even getting that diversity. And like I said, when you're asking and you're hiring these people, these are companies like I think like where Katie works, and I've worked at a similar one before. And so you don't always know who those people are either. And so we run into this with actually like anti-discrimination issues with who we hire, because we don't want to hire people, but we don't want to discriminate and only hire people of a very specific, socioeconomic background. But actually, we really need access to them, and I would love to pay them, but I can't put on the job rec, for the people who are going out and finding these annotators or these job writers. You need to be of this race or something like that, and I don't want to do that. But because we're not studying people, we're not, looking for participants, it's a lot harder to ask for those particular lived experiences that you want to represent. Yeah.
Yeah, all amazing points. And as everybody knows, the situation with just the letters DEI right now in the United States is just fraught with danger. So on top of the difficulty of actually finding the people at whatever company, politically, it's now a grenade, right? Like, what are you going to do? How's it going to look? Can you put out a report that says this? Is this going to be a line item where you're looking for diverse people, or is that going to, I don't know, get you shut down, or who knows? Like, who knows what's going to happen? But it's become practically more difficult, but also ideologically more difficult, it seems. Katie, do you have some more to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, absolute plus one to everything that Aubrie said. I think the question of like human generated data, which of course has its own issues with diversity, with, what people are we looking towards? Oftentimes, in my experience, we're finding that companies want human-generated data for very specific subject areas, right? So for medical content, for what other, I don't know, these very, very specific content areas. So we're hiring people particularly based on that. But for like general content, horizontal content, there is a huge shift towards synthetic data. What Aubrie was talking about is data that is trained or that is produced by AI models that are trained on some of that original content that they want the model to reproduce. And it can produce just absolutely massive, massive quantities of data. The thing that interacts with all of this is that these models have content guidelines, right? They have style guides, they have guardrails, they have best practices. Another place that I think linguists are uniquely suited to contribute, and this interacts with Aubrey's discussion of policy, right, is that when you're developing those guidelines, you have to have, or a lot of times you're asked to have a very prescriptive focus on style and content. We want the output to look exactly like this. We want it to contain XYZ content and nothing else. And that prescriptive focus on style can absolutely constrain the diversity of content in the output. So not only are you losing diversity in the actual generation of the training data, you're losing diversity in the output when the content guidelines are inflexible, are prescriptive, aren't taking any diversity in your user experience into account. And I think that a lot of times the issues with synthetic data go even beyond diversity. So as an example, if you're building a model that summarizes chat data, right? So like from a chat space, and you have synthetic data that has a message sent to a coworker, I'm going to schedule an oil change for my car on May 15th or something. That's not context appropriate. That's not a piece of data that would actually be sent. And obviously, this is a kind of innocuous, quote unquote, example of, a synthetic data context misfire. But the point remains that you lose all of the context that language is normally occurring in. And that's context that the human writers still have. So when you shift from human writers to synthetic data, you're also losing that context in the process.
Absolutely. This goes right into the next topic that we wanted to talk about. So with this production of synthetic data, which then gets turned around and put back in, opinions, what kind of effect do you think this is going to have on language use by humans? Right? I mean, we're now being exposed to this sort of stuff all the time. And we've talked about bias and we've talked about discrimination. So, Katie, if you want to just continue the thought there, what do you think this is going to mean for the way humans communicate with each other?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, right? But I do think this goes back to Alicia's comment on kind of data-rich versus under-resourced language varieties. So when we produce all of this language that's catered towards a very particular language variety, and a variety that's getting kind of a narrower and narrower definition, right? I mean, we all saw the problems with these large language models in the beginning, especially where you go on, you use them, and the output is immediately identifiable as AI. It's got a very clear structure. It's got like a very particular way of speaking. I do think that's getting better now, right? Because companies are realizing that they want that, whatever natural language is, right? They want that natural language experience. But again, they're defining that natural language within a very narrow range of context because it's easier to train a model to really narrow context. And I think what happens when we have all of these outputs that are geared towards this one very narrow, user experience, human experience with language, you're increasing the gap between data-rich and under-resourced language. And it makes it much more difficult to surface the data that is there for under-resourced languages, to engage with it, to make the case for why is this important? Why do we need to build this into our models? And this has real implications, right? So job searching, we've seen this huge wave of people talking about, AI-generated resumes, AI-generated cover letters. If they're all using the exact same language variety, the exact same way of speaking, the exact same framing, it really just means that that's likely to become kind of an expectation on an employer's side. And so you have people who don't exist in the same context, and it's going to create real issues.
Yeah. Yeah, Alicia, I think this gets right back to what you were saying about those strong emotional feelings, like feeling invisible. That's just what Katie was saying, right? You become erased because your language is not the expected form of the language.
Yeah, great point, Katie, because I was just thinking about some of the tools that are now built into some of the video conferencing apps that actually return statistics that would tell people who are going for that job interview or trying to do this business pitch because they want to create a startup, that would give them feedback about their own language. And so I actually had a personal experience of this in order for me to make a particular milestone in some business training that I was doing. I actually had to have my speech evaluated by one of these apps, and it tells you how many disfluencies you have. It tells you about syntactic complexity. It tells you about your perceived level of education. And I mean, I'm a linguist with a PhD, right? And I have been using Standard American English together with other varieties, but I code switch when I lecture. I code switch when I'm talking to my students, to my colleagues, and it came back and dinged me for a lot of the things that were aspects of code switching in a business pitch that I was doing. And that has a very direct implication for people's experiences when they're using these technologies that are using a single model of what would look like speech with very fluent disfluency with very few disfluencies, speech that had an appropriate level of syntactic complexity, right, for speech that had sufficiently high level of education to reflect well on the person. So one of the things that my research is definitely showing is that people of color are very aware that they have a very high level of language awareness. They are very aware of when they need to edit their speech in order to be perceived in another way. And so they're always projecting a different identity when they have to appear in certain environments. The emotions that people report when they know they have to do these things, I think reflect that because they know that they have to be someone else. They can't be themselves coming into some of these spaces. So like one of our respondents, this is actually work by one of my colleagues, Jay Cunningham, noticed that people said, they might normally say, cut on the lights, but they know that they have to say turn on the lights in order to be understood. So it's almost like you carry a couple of vocabularies with you into any interaction. And we have lots of examples where people end up angry or, one person, I'm looking at a quote on my other screen here where somebody said, I always feel dread calling insurance companies for my job because the speech recognition system never understands me. So even in their work, they're worried about this, how they're going to be evaluated, and whether or not they'll be able to attain higher levels in their desired career. All kinds of human impacts, right, that we're seeing as we use AI to do more and more things in the employment space.
Yeah. Some of those
Absolutely.
words that you just used, Alicia, just jump right out at me like appropriate, right? That's such a loaded word, or sufficiently. Who decides? And who, like that feels like another one of those tacit linguistic things that people think they know what it is, and it's partly our job, I think, as linguists to surface that and to say, what do we mean when we say appropriate? Like, who's deciding what's appropriate? And is that really true? Or is it, like one person over here who thinks it's appropriate and then we all have to go along with it? So I feel that. And the word dread is so eloquent. That's, yeah, amazing.
I encountered this term actually on Emily Bender's podcast, plug for that one, the other day from Nicole Holliday, who was talking about socially prescriptive speech technologies, right? You're prescribing that the person that you're analyzing, whose speech you're analyzing, is going to fit into this little box. They're going to behave a certain way. And she was speaking about automated sentiment analysis, essentially. So, if you're always tagging kind of positive sentiment as good and negative sentiment as bad, you're missing just this vast interplay of context, of emotion, of culture, of all of these things that we as linguists really work to surface and value. And it enables the development of really, really aggressively biased and narrow opportunities for success with these tools. And the people that are making the decisions about what is the prescription, right? Like, what's the box that you're supposed to fit into? These teams are generally not that diverse either. And they don't often have linguists on them, right? So you're not the people that are making the decisions about what is good, right? What's going to get you the higher education score? What does a reading level look like, in your user? The people making those decisions maybe are not going to be educated on language the way that we as linguists are, and be able to think about it as, a complex, organic, evolving system. It's going to be very static and narrow and, context independent, which of course language is not.
Yeah,
Aubrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I love that you just brought that up, because the evolution part, because it's something that I think, once again, non-linguists just don't really think of. Sure, they're like, oh yeah, there's some new slang, but that's like pretty much it. Maybe a couple new words get added here and there. So something that I think is really interesting with AI is, and this is another sentiment that I'm bringing from the AI snake oil book, which is that often practitioners don't think about the fact that the data that they have, especially in predictive models, but also in trying to train GenAI, the data that they have represents the system before you introduced AI. And so you're never going to be in that situation again. From now on, AI is there, and that has an effect, on how people interact. And so I usually deal with text. I haven't had as much experience with language, with spoken language data. So text is very easy to, block words and things like that, right? If it has these characters, it's not allowed to be written. Boom, that's the solution, right? Block list. So I am really concerned about the effect that block lists, or even fuzzy matching block lists, have on language evolution, especially reclamation of slurs, and also stigmatization of certain words. So there's a kind of a famous example from TikTok from before I was there, where suicide was on the block list, and it created this term unalive that all of Gen Z knows now. Well, I don't want to say all, most of Gen Z knows this term unalive, of course. And you can think of emojis that people use now to get around using certain words, right? Things that rhyme, things like that. And so there's always going to be this necessity to talk about these things, and people will find ways to do it. But what are we doing by saying no, on your first chance, you're not allowed to do that? What stigma does that create? And how does it get in the way of people actually, this natural, beautiful, beautiful process of people being able to take something that had such, heartbreaking history and turn it into something that removes that sting? If people are able to reclaim words, who are we to get in the way of that? But at the same time, those are the same people you're trying to protect. And so I am often in the position of being one of these people who needs to make these prescriptive decisions. And it's the exact people that we think we're protecting with the block list, we might be actually harming them the most with the block list, but I don't quite know what else to do, because we can't let the other people you're trying to protect them from use those words. And so not wanting to have like, I guess, context sensitive or speaker sensitive systems because I don't want to make a list of everybody's identities. I don't want you to tell me even. I don't really want to maintain a list of people who are of minoritized groups and say, oh, they're allowed to use these words because I don't want tech to have that list. But at the same time, I don't know how to allow them to be themselves when we have to treat everybody equally when they're behind just, a random username and a weird photo that's not even them.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me as I'm listening to you all talk is a misconception that I think most people would have is that things like trust and safety and guardrails are the same as prescriptivism, right? And they're not. But I think people think that way just because of their normal experience as humans going through life and going through school and being corrected on their language, that there is some objective good, that there is some objective appropriate, there is some objective standard, and if you don't meet it, there's something wrong with you, which is really different from things like Aubrie was talking about with trust and safety and guardrails and protecting people from potentially really dangerous speech or harmful speech. And I can't do that because it's not human, right? Like you need humans, linguists preferably, to make those kinds of distinctions and to set up things like guardrails because yeah, you can't. I was thinking, Aubrey, as you were talking, I think this happened on Facebook years and years ago where they were like, can't use the word breast or show a picture of it. It's like, well, no one can talk about breast cancer anymore. So, you know, you can't. It's like it's the sledgehammer for the butterfly sort of thing. You can't just do it like that. I would like to ask our panelists, not to so that we're getting a little doom scrolly here. Are there applications for large language models and this kind of AI that you could see as really positive? Aubrie had made a suggestion. Can we be using things like AI and LLMs to help preserve endangered languages or maybe to help people learn them? What other good things can we think of that we could put this to? I throw it out to anybody.
I can start. I agree. I think as language experts, we have a tendency, you call it doom scrolling. We have a tendency to doom spiral about the implications
Yeah.
of this technology, knowing what we do about the data that it's built on. And if you work in tech, like knowing about the processes and the decisions that you have to make that are necessarily going to have some sort of implication that sometimes you can't even know in the first place. But I do think there's a way to apply this generative technology to kind of augment human capability and human language use as opposed to replacing it. I do think it's a fine line, and I think we have to guard that line really viciously because a lot of the current applications of these like very big public-facing large language models are being used to, replace language use. We use the context of a job search, right? But, something like the other part of what my company does, which is transcription, translation, machine translation, that kind of thing. Machine translation is an old technology, but there are some applications for a generative version of it that is then assisted by human translators, human transcreators, that's going to make higher quality transcreation a little bit more financially accessible to companies who maybe can't afford to have an entire huge piece of content transcreated entirely by human writers because it's prohibitively expensive. So I do think there's ways in which we can kind of integrate human knowledge and human expertise, which by the way is still necessary. Like we're never not going to need this kind of language expertise. This is really important with a technology that makes it a little bit more efficient. The problem is when we take that technology and replace the human expertise, because in the current iteration of the technology, that's not something that's going to go well, I think. And I think that's what we as linguists pick up on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Alicia, can you talk a little bit about positive aspects maybe that you see coming out of your own work? Obviously, the big one is just gathering data and having the data, right? So people can use it for things. So what else comes to mind for you with good positive things that we can do?
Yeah, I think, well, it's not directly related to what I'm doing right now, but I actually, in my teaching, was thinking about this because I actually have found it helpful to use generative AI to help me to come up with alternative ways of saying something that would be very highly technical or very complicated. So actually, one of the examples that came to my mind was I needed to explain matrix multiplication. And I have a way that I've talked about it for a long time, but I wanted to find other more accessible ways of talking about that. And so in my classroom, I might I might ask ChatGPT about how to talk about matrix multiplication in a different way, or to explain it using colors if I want to come up with a good visualization, right? That may appeal to some of my students who get lost in the words, right? So actually, so then some of the examples that come to my mind relate to accessibility and some of the, like, I completely agree with Katie. I think that we have to be very careful about what we're doing. We have to make sure that we're guarding that line about production very carefully. But there are some ways that I found it to be really useful for me in my teaching.
Mm.
And I also I want to make the second point that I believe that there are some ways of protecting that linguists know some ways about protecting people's privacy. So a lot of the dialect features that I would like to see improved in AI models do not require labeled data in the sense that I'm giving up any of the demographics about my speaker, right? Some of them are general enough that I can mention a dialect region or a speech community, or a set of other characteristics that have to do with the intersectionalities of my speakers, and teach new categories in that way that can be more nuanced because of what I know as a linguist. And I guess I'm really thinking about, this is a little bit of a stretch, but I have to mention Joy Buolamwini's work here. I think that her work in algorithmic justice, and I'm thinking particularly of her spoken word piece, Ain't I a Woman? Is absolutely, it's like always emblazoned on my mind here, because facial recognition, for those people who don't know, this was a spoken word piece, very artistic piece where African American women's voices were submitted to facial recognition, and more than 66% of Black women's faces were returned as male. So misgendering is happening using AI because somehow Black women's faces are too hard to understand, or are not female, right? Or things like this. But there's learning that needs to happen here. And I think that knowing where this gap is, knowing where this type of bias exists, is important to actually work on. And so that's facial rec. That's completely out of my wheelhouse. But I do think that being able to understand some of these intersectionalities, especially if we're then going to try to generate speech for Black women, but we need to weed out male faces, male exemplars, right? In order to do that, that's some of the work that we need to do to improve the way that AI works.
Mm. That's great. Awesome examples also. And I think the whole accessibility discussion too, which we're not going to get into too much today, is one way that AI can be incredibly helpful, just making things available to people. Um, and I mean accessibility in the biggest way, not just what we would call disabled people or differently abled people, but a broad swath of people being able to have access to things and understand them in ways that they couldn't before. Aubrie, do you have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential in personalization, in the fact that like if I think about my like Spotify, my algorithm, my taste profile, it has taken in so many pieces of data and tried to decide, what sorts of things I might predict, what sorts of things I might like. So that's maybe a little different than a language personalized model, but you could think of it in the same way. The fact that like over time, maybe your phone learns the spelling of a name of someone, for your spell check that is a non-standard spelling. So things like that, those little things that can do the opposite of making people feel erased. It can make them feel actually like, okay, it gets me, it knows me. I think there's a lot of potential impact there. I'm just not sure if people are, if it's being invested in as much as it could be. But I think that like having your own personal model that, knows you from a certain company, from Microsoft or Apple or whatever, and it knows your speech, it knows your style, it knows your voice. And maybe it can understand you better and also write things for you better, that are, closer to what you would actually write and take less editing for you to actually use. I think that that could really help people feel seen. It's just about the ethics of it and the failures of it, and are those going to be worth the potential pros? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was just reminded as you were talking that the title for this particular thing is about ethical uses of AI, and we've been talking about ethics all along, although not using that word. So I'm glad you brought it up. And that leads me into the final big discussion question for each of you is like, what's concerning for you? Like, what are you thinking about the most when it comes to this in terms of uses and ethics? Like, what is the core? I've seen online, Emily Bender talked about some stuff, and I've seen things from other linguists as well about what keeps you up at night. What is the concern for you? So, Aubrie, why don't you kick this one off?
Sure. And I think that this has been covered a lot, and so probably won't be a surprise. But I think the just potential for AI to like further this sort of English imperialism around the whole world, as well as the the imperialism of standard American English within the United States. And I think the kind of devaluing, there's like an implicit devaluing, right? I thought
Hmm.
about this a lot because I came from the English teaching. That's how I got into linguistics, was through English teaching abroad. And, there's a lot of sort of questions you ask yourself once you realize how the world is set up. You go, oh, wait, was I actually like contributing to a problem? Am I like going out there and saying you need to be able to, an accent stigma is obviously a huge thing too. So, teaching people you need to be able to speak in this way. And it's usually the standard, often, especially if they're adults and they're looking for professional business English training. Um, and so you have to kind of ask yourself, like, oh, how, like, what are the pros and cons of prescriptivism here? Like, I am helping people to communicate and access job opportunities that they would not have otherwise, and maybe move to a country they wouldn't be able to move to otherwise. So of course I want to do that. But at the same time, we're just sort of reinforcing this global system, where you have to learn English, and that is like the highest valued language, and that people who just, speak it and don't feel any pressure to learn another language because they feel that they already have the highest value thing. Why would I go learn something else? Like
Hmm.
that sort of mentality, I'm afraid that this might just reinforce it a bit. So, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, excellent point. Katie, what about you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so much here, right? And I agree with Aubrey. I think we've covered a lot of it. Um, I think kind of at a higher level, all the things that we're talking about, right? That kind of prescriptive imperative towards being a certain way, speaking a certain variety, interacting a certain way. I think that it can have identity implications if left unchecked, right? Because you're asking people to be a certain kind of person and take the same perspective that these systems take implicitly. It's not an explicit thing. And one of the interesting things I think about this entire evolution of this industry is, AI has been around for a long time, right? People didn't know they were interacting with AI for a lot of it. So something like facial recognition, or like I think we mentioned at one point, insurance, right? Applying for insurance, applying for a mortgage, something like that. People didn't really realize they were interacting with AI. Now people know. People are hyper aware. They're hyper aware of the text outputs they get back. They're hyper aware of searching content for AI generated language. But I do think that awareness comes with this imperative to try and maximize the technology, maximize your chances against this technology, right? So something like what Alicia was talking about, where it's giving you a score on something, it's encouraging you to behave a certain way. And for myself, I'm neurodivergent. I have ADHD. It's almost encouraging this like masked version of my identity to present a certain way, when that's something that's already kind of a problem for me. But I think we start applying that to more and more people, asking more and more people to hold a certain perspective, to be a certain kind of way, to interact with the technology the same way that everyone else does. I do think that's a problem. And I think if we can integrate more diverse perspectives, more diversity of applications into these products, we're gonna see a positive effect from that and buffer these potential identity implications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Alicia, I think you've been saying that all along. More thoughts on this?
Yeah, I actually am thinking about intergenerational interactions with AI. We haven't talked at all about this, but we do definitely see that there are people of particular generations that know how to act and know how to perform and know how to interact with the technology. So if we're talking about human-computer interactions, right, from that space, there's also an age bias toward that we see when it comes to who's interacting. But, you know, when we think about the increasing number of I don't know, Internet of Things technologies that are out there, if we continue to think about voice-enabled technologies that people use on the phone to pay their bills, older people are being pushed out, or they are having younger people interact with the technology on their behalf because it's really, the learning curve is really steep. And this is not a blanket statement. Of course, there are people who are older. I mean, I hope to be one of them who continues to track with technology and figure out what I need to figure out as it changes and it interacts with the systems that I need to use in my daily life. But right now, we are definitely seeing the discontinuation on the part of people of particular generations from interacting with the technology. And I think that that's when we talk about the kinds of barriers to participation, that age-related biases are important for us to think about here too.
That's a really, really good point. I think we all see that in our lives with our parents or grandparents or peers even. So thanks for bringing that up. I want to make one more point and then we'll go and we'll take some questions here at the end. For me, part of my concern is that people are trusting AI in a way that they shouldn't be. And this comes up with, so if you use Google Chrome, they get that AI overview at the top when you ask a question. It's often wrong, and it's often wrong in really like horrible ways. It's telling you incorrect information. It's giving you instructions on doing something that's just plain wrong. And this even extends down to definitions for words and use of language. So I feel like that's a more subtle impact. You know, if you're asking, what does this word mean? Or what does this name mean? Or what does this term mean? And you're getting a wrong answer from the AI, now it's in your head. And it's so much harder to correct a misconception than it is to get the right information to start with. So I'm just worried that there's now going to be a lot of work that people in general, teachers or linguists, to correct all of these misconceptions that people had because AI told them some garbage. And it just like you can't stop it, right? When you log into Google, that's the first thing that comes up is the AI overview, and you have to um, opt out of it in a very physical way by scrolling past it. And I don't know how many people do that. I do,
Mm.
but I think I'm in the minority. So I worry about that.
Yeah.
And lastly, I just want to provide a quote which I saw just this morning on Tumblr. Yeah, I'm on Tumblr. And it relates to what we've been saying. So this person says, there's nothing funnier to me than when AI does math wrong. Like, I get why it happens. It's a language model that's treating the numbers you feed it as words rather than integers, and then giving you an answer based on how those words typically appear in a block of text instead of actually performing a calculation. But it's the one thing that computers are genuinely incredible at. You screwed up a perfectly good calculator is what you did. Look at it. It's got hallucinations. And I like that's it, right? That's what we're doing is we're taking a calculator and we're making it talk. I don't know. So anyway, I just wanted to leave that because it made me laugh so hard that I saw that just this morning as I was having my breakfast. Um, so we've got some questions here. Let's see, Alex, did you want to read some of the questions that we had?
Yes, thank you. Do you all have any thoughts on how linguists can/should find their way into industry roles? If an AI company doesn't yet realize they need a linguist, what can be done to raise that awareness? And on the flip side, how can junior linguists seek out opportunities to contribute to AI development, especially when job postings don't explicitly mention linguistics?
Yeah, anybody.
So I can start with this. I'm going to plug my grad program was actually geared towards getting linguists into industry, which is a super exciting thing. First of all, there's a lot of space for you. Second of all, I think job postings that talk about data annotation, data curation for generative AI, what they're talking about is language, right? So if you are able to discuss the kind of work that you do in the same terms that the industry uses, and this takes a bit of research, right? Look up like what do tech companies mean when they say data curation, data annotation, data labeling. What does all that mean? Because the likelihood is, if you're a linguist, you've already done all that work. You've already done that kind of thing in your research, and you have, if not publications, you have papers, you have work that you've done for classes that shows all of those skills, and you can put those in a portfolio. There's no reason you can't use your academic work as a representation of what your skills are. So that's the first part. I would also say that there's a lot of companies now, and I think Aubrie and I both had this experience of coming up through a company that does that kind of vendor for a large tech company providing data services. There's a lot of ways that we can talk about that kind of work, but I think as a place to learn what tech is looking for and what kind of data is going into the AI, what kind of decisions are being made, it's a really good opportunity. And there's a lot of freelance work out there now. And so, I started with my company as a freelancer when I was in my graduate school program. And the experience was absolutely invaluable. And when I came in as a program manager, I already had this really foundational understanding of what the goals were, right? Like, what were we trying to achieve with the data that we were curating, labeling, annotating, whatever it is that we're doing. These are skills you already have. If you gain the context, all of a sudden you're a really exceptional candidate for a role like this because you have a thorough understanding of the mechanisms behind the language and not just the work itself.
Great, really perfect. I would also say, if you are employed either as a freelancer or at a company, there's always room to evangelize for more linguists. I think a lot of linguists do that. It's one question I always ask people when I interview them on the CareerCast is to say, how many linguists work at your company? And most often what I hear is, I was the first and then I brought more people on. And, that's the way to do it. So if you are employed, you should, do it. Evangelize linguists.
+1. My company did it that way also. We started with one linguist, and he brought one other linguist who brought 5 other linguists, and all of a sudden it's a company full of linguists, plus, the people that were already there in transcreation and localization. All of a sudden you've got a whole group of language experts, and it makes a totally different experience.
Yeah, awesome.
One of the conversations that I just had with somebody was one where we talked about the fact that she's looking for work and having a difficult time thinking about moving from the academic into the industry space. And one of the things that we talked about was, over time, it's become really apparent to me that we should go to conventions. We should go to industry conventions and conferences and listen to how people who are presenting at those conventions and conferences talk about language, and then kind of learn where we might fit in their particular landscape, and how to translate our own skills, as Katie was sort of talking about, in ways that that will make us more legible to them. So, and I know that Alex Johnston talks about this all the time. You have skills that, and Laurel, you talked about this too, maybe the ways that you think about your technical expertise are really not the super important things to be able to highlight on your CV. You might want to talk about your experience collecting data, your ability to organize it, to be able to create, even if you've created scripts, right? Even if you've done some programming that involves working with language structures, those kinds of things might be things that feel like they were part of your background training or things that you needed to learn in order to be able to do your thesis. But they may be things that make you that really extraordinary candidate. So go to those conferences, hear what people are talking about, and then take notes on how you might translate yourself so that you can be legible for them.
Yeah, great suggestions. I want to add on one thing to that, which has come up a lot with talking with people. Alicia, you were just saying a lot of your basic linguistic training just feels so basic you don't even talk about it. And then for other people, it's the you're amazing part of it. Do not ever use the words just or only when you're describing what you did. Oh, I just did data collection. I only looked at a couple of data sets. Never use those words because that you are devaluing yourself. Like what you did is important. So talk about it like it's important. Um, Alex, can we have another question? I think we've got time for one more, maybe.
Yes, thanks so much for raising the issue of how AI tools often miss words and utterances that human listeners easily understand. I'm curious about the extent to which theories from applied linguistics inform AI training in industry. Specifically, I'm thinking of the intelligibility principle, which may be associated with John Levis from Iowa State University, and concepts like intelligibility, comprehensibility, and accentedness associated with Tracy Derwing and Murray Monroe, among others. To what extent do you think
Anybody?
those applied theories have made it
Yeah.
into the work that you do?
Yeah. Anybody just jump in if you've got an answer. This is not my area, so I'm going to let you guys talk. It's a big question.
That's an answer in itself. So a bit of silence about that.
Yeah,
It-
maybe not.
yeah, it's a big question, and I can't say that I use it specifically, but I definitely have been influenced by Monroe and Derwing's work, I will say, and that, makes its way into the work that I do. Um, but thinking about the notions of comprehensibility and intelligibility um, are certainly drivers for the ways that we think about um, variation and the naturalness of variation and communicating the idea that um, there can be confusion about what systematic variation actually looks like and how normal it is and how we shouldn't be biased against it. And for me, a lot of that actually works its way into thinking about language ideologies and talking about um, how there are notions about what intelligible speech is that get inadvertently baked into the way that we do our model development.
Mhm.
So I would say that I probably use that work the most in talking with industry specialists and talking with engineers, and sort of opening up some of that conversation about what is assumed to be the most intelligible speech, what is
Mhm.
assumed to be the best sentence output from a comprehensibility standpoint, and helping people to realize that there is ideology kind of underlying what their ideas are of what they have to develop toward. So that's, I guess, that's the way that I would come about answering that question.
Yeah, I think that gets right back to those ideas about appropriateness and suitability and bias. It's all right there in the ideology.
I think one thing that this makes me think of, I'm not super familiar with the intelligibility theory, so I might be off here, but I will say that even in my short career, the change in what the goal should be when speaking a second language, now that technology is such a big part of it, um, it's something that I've already seen basically kind of shift. So like when I was first learning how to teach English, to speakers of other languages, it was like, don't worry about accent, don't worry about sounding a certain way, don't worry about sounding like a native speaker, like kind of just give up on that. That's fine. Worry about getting what you need to get done. Like you're going to be in another country, you're going to need to, get a driver's license. Like, can they understand you? And it was all about intelligibility, which was much more about the sort of discourse analysis and the back and forth. And you had a participant who, probably knew where you were from or could figure it out and could figure out maybe how to help you. And so you were relying on a lot of those factors. And the goal was like, can you get this transactional thing done? And so maybe like an evaluation of your language would be, can you go out in the real world and get something transactional done with a native speaker? Can you go to a restaurant and order, can you get through a whole meal and have it go smoothly? And then you were like, yes, I did it. But now, if you're learning on Duolingo the whole time, you're already catering to the ASR. And so you're not actually catering to speakers of that language. You're catering to the technology and like how well that system was developed. And so I can already see like a difference in the goals there, affecting the process and also the motivation, the motivation is huge when you're learning a second language. And so I would be more motivated by speaking with other people, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. So we're just about out of time. Unless you guys have any last thoughts. I mean, we've covered so much today. This has been such a great, wide-ranging discussion, and we've really done a deep dive into some of these. Let's keep talking about this stuff. And for all the linguists out there, these are the things you need to be thinking about if you're working in AI. I would like to tell you that this is going to be available on our YouTube channel probably in about a week. It'll be available on the CareerCast podcast shortly after that. If you look in the chat, Alex has been putting in lots of places where you can get resources. So if you're interested in jobs in industry, the Linguistics Career Launch has lots and lots of documents and stuff on our YouTube channel that you can find. And I encourage you also to look up our panelists and maybe follow them on LinkedIn and see all the great work that they've been doing. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for your time today. This has been just wonderful. I'm so delighted. And Aubrie was on the CareerCast podcast. That was really fun. So we're going to continue to talk to linguists. Keep tuning in. Like I said, this will be up in several weeks. And thank you all for your questions and for your patience and attendance today. This has been awesome. Thanks.